The COVID-19 pandemic has presented many challenges, both on a personal and professional level. As an emerging conservator, I felt lucky to be on a graduate internship during this time, and I'm grateful to the Chester Beatty and the Heritage Council for supporting and extending my internship for a second year. Last year, my talk was focused on long-term conservation projects, in particular the treatment of an 18th century Indian manuscript. This year, I want to discuss some of the work processes that go on behind the scenes at the Chester Beatty, focusing on collaborative aspects of conservation and highlighting a few smaller treatments. I will also share some of the book models I made during lockdown. The Chester Beatty is a museum containing the book arts collection of Sir Alfred Chester Beatty, a mining magnate, philanthropist, and collector. The museum opened in 1954, and Chester Beatty gifted his art collection to the Irish state after his death in 1968. The collection includes objects ranging from early biblical papyri to Islamic manuscripts, Egyptian books of the dead through to Japanese woodcut prints and scrolls, Buddhist texts to Old Master prints, and one of the largest collections of Chinese jade books in the world, and these are just a few examples. With such a valuable and rare collection of treasures, it is important to find a balance between making sure the collections are accessible to both the public and scholars, and preservation needs to ensure the longevity of the collection. While the collection is the heart of the museum, there is a team of people working hard behind the scenes to care for, research, and promote the collections, finding new ways to help people access and connect with the objects. Conservation does not happen in a vacuum. The Conservation Department fits into the larger infrastructure of the museum. We are part of the collections team. This also includes curators, registrars, education, digital, and research services. As a graduate intern, I have learnt not only through my own projects, but through watching, listening, and collaborating with other conservators and museum professionals. Conservation assists with the rotations of objects in the permanent galleries, Arts of the Book, and Sacred Traditions. Each gallery is broken into East Asian, Islamic, and Western sections. As the collection is primarily manuscripts, rare books, and decorative arts, most objects are made of paper, papyrus, parchment, textile, and more, all of which are sensitive to light, temperature, and humidity. To preserve the objects, they are only on display for a limited amount of time. The light levels are kept below 50 lux to prevent fading, and temperature and humidity levels are monitored. The current schedule is that all the objects in either Arts of the Book or Sacred Traditions gallery are rotated each year. Changing the objects on display also allows visibility for a greater proportion of the collection. Only approximately 2% of the 25,000 objects in the collection are on show at any one time. Alongside the permanent galleries, the Chester Beatty also has a temporary gallery space, currently showing the exhibition Edo in Colour, Prints from Japan's Metropolis. Temporary exhibitions such as these require a huge amount of work to prepare and collaboration between all of the collection teams. For Edo in Colour, this work started even earlier, as the Japanese prints in the collection were assessed, treated if necessary, and mounted as part of a larger rehousing project worked on by the previous Heritage Council intern Adam Macklin. We are currently working towards the next temporary exhibition together with Islamic curator Dr. Moya Carey. This will be called Meeting in Isfahan, Vision and Exchange in Safavid, Iran, which will open in February 2022. The conservation processes for both temporary exhibitions and rotations are broadly similar. Starting from a list put together by the exhibiting curator, we assess whether each object is stable enough to display estimate how long treatment would take, and decide whether this is feasible in the time frame before the exhibition. These initial checks are normally done with the curator so they can choose the opening and check the dimensions to plan the space. It also facilitates interdisciplinary discussions, as the content history and the physical characteristics of the object can be examined together. Once the list is final, conservation creates an action plan to complete treatments, mounting, and arrange cradles and frames. We work closely with curators throughout the preparation stage and right up to when the exhibition opens. Digitization runs alongside exhibition preparation. Taking high-quality photographs and making them available to view online increases and diversifies access to the collection. The digitization department at the Chester Beatty was set up in 2017. While the eventual aim is to digitize the whole collection, the vast number of objects make this an ongoing process. Currently, over 10% of the collection is now digitized. Priorities for digitization are largely driven by exhibitions, publications, and external interests. Conservation is a crucial part of the digitization workflow, as we complete checks to assess the condition of the object and whether it is safe to go to photography. At the same time, we also do reader checks to evaluate whether the object is in a good enough condition that it can be handled by researchers. These checks consist of providing an overall condition assessment, writing brief condition notes relevant to digitization and readers, and recording any damage which they need to be aware of. Examples of this include large tears, ink corrosion, broken sewing, detached folios, and powdery or flaking media. Depending on the severity of the damage, I would either include handling instructions to mitigate risk to the object, or record that the object requires conservation treatment prior to further access. Carrying out the checks is one of my favourite parts of the week, as I'm lucky enough to see a range of collection objects from diverse cultures and time periods. This has helped me understand different structures and materials, practice handling, and learn more binding terminology. I would like to share a few examples of recent treatments I have undertaken to prepare objects for future use in exhibitions or digitization. These two 18th century Japanese woodblock prints in a triptych format required interventive conservation treatment before display in the Edo in Colour exhibition. After discussion with the East Asian curator, Dr. Mary Redfern, the decision was taken to remove the acidic backing board adhered to the prints. These were masking the physical properties of the flexible Japanese paper and causing increased discoloration and degradation. The backing boards are not original and would have been added in the 19th or early 20th century, likely by a collector in the West. I mechanically removed the backings one layer at a time using a rounded scalpel blade until the layer closest to the print was reached. I tested to make sure that the adhesive was water-soluble and that all colours were stable in water and IMS. Then I carried out an overall wet treatment to remove the final layer, reduce stains, and remove residual acidity from the prints. Washing the prints was very much a team effort, and I worked with book and paper conservator Julia Poirier over 2 days to remove the backing and wash the print. The stains were much reduced by washing, as you can see here. Afterwards, I float mounted both prints, ready for framing and exhibition. As well as more interventive treatments, rehousing is an important part of conservation, and we mount objects for exhibitions and create boxes for storage. This Japanese woodblock print, cut to fan shape, was inlaid and float mounted in a window mount. This beautiful Armenian Gospel manuscript has had previous interventions. When it was rebound, the folios were trimmed and 14 illustrated folios were removed and stored in glazing. As 2 of these folios are going on display in the western section of the Sacred Traditions Gallery, I was tasked with taking them out of glazing and remounting them. The manuscript text block is parchment, as you can see here. However, some of the loose folios had undergone a previous remargining treatment where the borders of the parchment had been removed and replaced with paper. When deglazing 3 of these folios, I discovered that the margins hadn't actually been replaced as it first appeared. The parchment had been overlaid with a modern Western paper, but it wasn't adhered except on the small areas where the painting went outside of the frame. These painted areas had been cut out of the original parchment and adhered to the overlaying paper. We decided to remove the paper on top to reveal the margins of the original folio and reintegrated the small painted areas. I kept the paper that was removed to give it to the curator as it is part of the history of the object. Interestingly, 2 of the 3 folios had text and imagery on the verso that was hidden before. These can now be digitized and catalogued. Another object that needed treatment, this time for rotation into the western section of the permanent galleries, was an 18th century printed Hebrew book with a red leather cover. The book had partially broken joints, detached folios, loss of rolled endband paper, loose endband cores, and broken sewing throughout. Minor conservation was required to handle it safely and for display in the Western Sacred Gallery rotation. After documentation, I secured the loose endband cores and remaining rolled paper. Working with the curator of Western Collections, Dr. Jill Uncle, to ensure correct placement, I repaired and tipped in the detached folios. Hooked guards were not possible due to limited accessibility to the spine and tight sewing. Then I repaired the breaks in the joints between the spine and the lower and upper boards using toned Japanese paper. I added W hinges on the inner joints to provide extra support for the upper and lower covers. Although the book is much more stable, it will still be fragile even after the treatment due to the broken sewing. However, we advocate for minimal intervention and the damage was not severe enough to warrant a complete resewing and loss of original material. Another Hebrew printed book that I worked on recently is the 16th century Torah, printed by Alvis Bragadin Printing House in Venice. This Renaissance-style binding is covered with stamped alum-tawed pigskin. There is evidence of where the metal clasps were attached but had been lost. While the text block was in good condition, the upper and lower boards were severely damaged, with lifting leather, insect holes, and pasteboards delaminating. After lightly surface cleaning, I rebuilt the boards around the corners to fully protect the text block. I flattened the crumpled pasteboard, inserting then building up layers of Japanese tissue with wheat starch paste until it reached a similar thickness to the rest of the board. I then toned Japanese tissue with acrylic paint to match the leather and used it to cover the new corners. I also rebuilt the end cap at the head of the book with Japanese tissue folded over a rolled core for additional structure and pasted it underneath the remainder of the original leather. Lastly, I unfolded and pasted down the lifted leather by using dry wheat starch paste, secured the lifting paste downs, and cleaned and repaired the front end paper and first folio. This was a very satisfying treatment to complete, as it is easy to see the impact and it feels like the cover now functions better. This 16th century Uranium manuscript was flagged for conservation treatment before digitization and future display. There were large splits along the borders in the paper on folio 1 and folio 24. So I repaired these with Japanese tissue to make the book safe for handling. A painting on folio 30 had large losses and pigment in poor condition, so brush consolidation with 2% Bermacol was applied. I also infilled the small losses with toned Japanese tissue and tipped back down an old textile repair along the spine fold to aid with opening. Working with the curator of Islamic collections, Dr. Moya Kerry, I also began to condition assess and conserve objects for the future Isfahan exhibition. 2 album pages from CBL IN47 were requested for the exhibition, which gave us the chance to take a holistic approach and remount all the folios in conservation standard medium-sized mounts. The objects were either float-mounted or had a small overmount, allowing more of the painting and decorative borders to be viewed. An interesting discovery was made when deglazing and remounting CBL IN47.1. Under transmitted light, it became clear that the 2 parts, previously mounted recto and verso, were in fact originally part of the same page. I was able to inlay them and mount them together. Once treatment and mounting are complete, the next step is to prepare the objects for display. Mounted objects can either go into sealed cases or into frames. We frame the works ourselves and ensure they are sealed in a safe microclimate and protected from dust for the duration of the exhibition. For objects in the permanent galleries or 3-dimensional objects in the temporary galleries, we either order or create custom cradles. With books, it is important to consider the opening angle so as not to put the binding structure under unnecessary stress, especially when it is going to stay in that position for an extended period of time. Each book is individual and may be comfortable opening to a different degree. We tend not to go beyond a 110-degree opening angle. The tilt of the cradle must also be determined depending on the height the book will be displayed at. Most commonly, this is between 30 to 40 degrees. Making cradles is a specialist and time-consuming job. At the Chester Beatty, most of our cradles are ordered from an expert mount maker. Our mounts are customized to fit the profile of each manuscript and made of clear perspex, an inert material that is safe to be in direct contact with collection material and appears almost invisible so as not to detract from the object. We keep and reuse these cradles as much as possible. However, on occasion we need to make a cradle for an object ourselves. This was the case with the cradle for this folding album of colour woodblock prints, currently on show in the Edo in Colour exhibition. I created a Concertina card cradle, folding the card to match the folds in the book and adding feet to increase stability and tilt the cradle at 30 degrees, as the book was to be exhibited on a shelf below eye level. This was my first time making this kind of cradle at the Chester Beatty, and it was a fun, if challenging, endeavour. As a smaller institution, we do not have an in-house art handling team, and conservation organises the installation and deinstallation of exhibitions and rotations, alongside curators and the museum registrar. Art handlers are often employed to aid with the installation of frames in temporary galleries. In a normal year, collection loans would also be a conservation priority. At the beginning of 2020, I completed condition reports and the temporary remounting for 2 objects going on loan. This has taught me how to write a thorough condition report that captures all the damage and puts it in terms others can follow. For one of the loans, I had the opportunity to accompany Curator of Western Collections, Dr. Jill Uncle, to courier and install the object, helping me to learn about the loan process firsthand. We also have a list of long-term conservation priorities. One of these is the rehousing of the Papyrus collection. Papyrus predates paper. It is made from the pithy stem of the papyrus water plant that grows along the banks of the River Nile in Egypt. The papyrus strips are arranged perpendicularly and pressed to form a sheet. Due to their fragility, papyrus fragments are mounted between glass with small strips of Japanese paper to secure them. At the moment, we are making sure all the glazed papyrus is stored in boxes with interleaving and reglazing any papyrus with broken glass or lifting tape. Blogs and social media have become increasingly important this year as ways to connect with museum audiences. The Chester Beatty now has 3 departmental blogs covering conservation, digitization, and education. I have written several posts for the Chester Beatty conservation blog and have found them a good way to gather knowledge about different conservation techniques or reflect on treatments I have undertaken. There is an academic side to conservation, and publishing research is a good way to share knowledge, ranging from treatment case studies to structural or material investigation to studies on the future of the profession. Julia and Christine have been an inspiration in this respect, as both are excellent writers and have had multiple pieces published in academic journals. They recently published articles in the Care and Conservation of Manuscript 17, Julia writing about Samaritan bindings and Christine writing about an early Quran manuscript. They are also both contributors to an upcoming Routledge book on the conservation of books. I hope to publish a co-authored article with 2 other graduate interns titled Mentorship Matters, the Value of Graduate Internships for the emerging conservator edition of the Journal of the Institute of Conservation. Despite very few in-person group activities taking place over the last 2 years, we have found ways to do CPD, and I have attended a wide range of lectures, workshops, and online conferences. Within the Chester Beatty, I have made a range of book models based on manuscripts in the collection, with the guidance of Christine and Julia. Here you can see a retroso model I made in a Zoom workshop with Julia. This is a Japanese multi-quire binding. There is more information about this kind of binding in Julia's latest blog post on the Chester Beatty Conservation blog. Christine taught me how to make one of the Nag Hammadi bindings based on Chapter 5 of Julia Miller and Pamela Spitzmiller's book Meeting by Accident. Named after the Egyptian village they were discovered in 1945, the 11 Nag Hammadi codices are dated to the 4th century, among the oldest bound texts ever discovered. Here is my model of Codex 7. Made of papyrus, it has a simple leather binding held together with paste and leather tackets. Christine also guided me through the process of making an Andalusi binding. This style of binding originates from the territory known as Al-Andalus, a historic kingdom based in modern Portugal and Spain under Islamic rule from the 8th to the 11th century. Diverging from an Islamic case binding structure, the spine is attached to an extended textile and paper spine lining that forms the basis of the board attachment. I used the spine lining technique to do a conservation rebinding of the Indian manuscript I conserved last year, as it was both sympathetic to the original Islamic binding and offers a non-adhesive alternative to a pasted textile spine lining. To complement the book models I made in the Chester Beatty, external workshops on specific bindings were also undertaken. I have taken 2 excellent online workshops with ICON accredited conservator Anne-Marie Miller, making a parchment stationery binding and a limp conservation binding in the Chris Clarkson style. Making book models helps me gain a greater understanding of the structure and mechanics of these historic bindings and the development of the codex. It was also a good way to practice binding techniques in preparation for conserving future manuscript material. My models aren't perfect, especially since all of them were made at home during lockdown with limited equipment, and I still have a lot to learn about bookbinding, but I really enjoyed the process and feel it has taught me valuable skills that apply to book conservation. Working on diverse projects with teams across the Chester Beatty has given me a true insight into the complex behind-the-scenes processes that keep a museum running. I have found these collaborative projects particularly interesting and enjoyed learning from my colleagues across the museum. I am hopeful that this experience will enhance my conservation practice by helping me to situate my work within a wider museum context. I would like to say thank you again to the Heritage Council and the patrons of Chester Beatty for funding my internship. Despite the pandemic, I've had a wonderful experience as the Chester Beatty Conservation Intern and feel I have been able to continue my professional development and grow in confidence as an emerging conservator. I have enjoyed working with such an amazing collection, and I have learned how to approach different materials, gain new skills, and improved my decision making. I have loved being a part of the Chester Beatty team, and I'm very thankful to Christine and Julia in particular for their ongoing mentorship and support over the last 2 years. Thank you for attending my talk today. I hope you enjoyed it.